So Geshe Tenzin Namdak, by way of introduction, grew up in the Netherlands. He worked as an environmental researcher before starting his studies of Buddhism at the Maitreya Institute in the Netherlands in 1993. He took ordination from His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, and began formal studies for the Geshe degree in 1997 at Sarajay Monastic University in South India. 20 years later, he completed it. Currently, he is the resident teacher at Jamyang Buddhist Center in London. I was fortunate enough to study the first module of the basic program with Geshe-la, and I can attest to his excellence as a teacher, being both knowledgeable and articulate, and also with a good sense of humor. So Geshe-la, whenever you're ready, please start to teach. Thank you.
Yeah, ready to go. Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much for organizing, and yeah, my first time in the US, so to say, related with the Buddhist Center in the US. So yeah, very happy to be here with you all. And yeah, before we start, because this is a cycle of a few texts by Arya Nagarjuna, right? So try to generate for every event or every step in life, so to say, it's important to have a good kind of motivation. So try to have a correct motivation for engaging in studies of Nagarjuna's fundamental wisdom. Yeah, so there will be quite a few chapters that we'll be going through. Yeah, myself a few, and then Georges Dreyfus will take care of a few. So try to generate the correct motivation for all that. And well, for the purpose of a few aspects, especially today, we're going to talk about 12 links from the point of view of accomplishing present rebirth. We can think about the 12 links, right? And also from the point of view eliminating suffering, samsara, we have to understand the 12 links, and to generate compassion for the mind of all sentient beings, the benefit of all sentient beings. Then also we see that they're wandering around in samsara by the power of the 12 links. So try to think that today the subject being the 12 links, in order to understand that, for the particular purpose of liberating sentient beings from all the suffering, yeah, in relation with samsaric suffering. And yeah, that's why we're here, and that's why we study it. So try to generate correct motivation. Yeah, and then based on motivation, we're going to recite a few prayers. And well, the common prayers of praise to Sakyamuni Buddha, the Heart Sutra, yeah, the essential teaching of the Buddha, as well as the foundation for good qualities, to remember our stages of the path to enlightenment. Yeah, and then we do a short mandala, and then we can start. So while you do the prayers, think in front of yourself as Sakyamuni Buddha, surrounded by the masters of India, Tibet, and the other Buddhist traditions. And surrounding yourself are countless mother sentient beings, and think about their types of suffering, and think you have the responsibility to do something about it, because we have a connection with the Dharma now, and we have a connection of interest in developing our mind. So we have responsibility towards sentient beings, and not only going to develop our mind, but also lead them in the prayers. So take that into account. Then we recite the prayers together. Yeah. So to the praise Sakyamuni Buddha. Yeah. To the founder, the transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the full destroyer, the complete, perfect, full awakened being, perfect in knowledge and good conduct. The God and of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods, human beings, to you, the complete, fully awakened one, the now transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, subdue from the Sakya clan, prostrate me, go to refuge. To the founder and transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the full destroyer, the complete, perfect, full awakened being, perfect in knowledge and good conduct. The God and over the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods, human beings, to you, the complete, fully awakened one, the down transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, subdue from the Sakya clan, prostrate me, go to refuge. To the founder and transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the full destroyer, the complete, perfect, full awakened being, perfect in knowledge and good conduct. The God and over the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the complete, fully awakened one, the down transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, subdue from the Sakya clan, prostrate me, go to refuge. When you were supreme amongst humans, you were born in this earth, you played out 7 strides, and then said, I'm supreme in this world. You are wise and I prostrate. With pure bodies, form sublimely pure, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain. Flame that blazes in the 3 worlds, wind of the best, Lord, you prostrate. With supreme science, face like a spotless moon, color like gold, you prostrate. Thus free like you, the three worlds are not. Incomparable wise one, to you prostrate. The Savior have a great compassion, the founding of understanding. The field of merit, the qualities like a vast ocean. To you, the one come to dustness, I prostrate. The purity that frees from attachment, the virtue that frees from the lower realms, the one part sublime pure reality, the Dharma pacifies, I prostrate. Those who are liberated and show the path to liberation, the only field qualified realizations, who are devoted to the moral precepts, to you, sublime community and virtue, I prostrate. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha. To all three I devote homage. To all worldly of respect, bound with bodies as many realms in all aspects. With supreme faith I pay homage. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly, this is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a vibration, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, or bubble. A dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see constituencies as such. To this merits may all sentient beings attain the rank of all saints, a beautiful fall, delivered from the star ocean, perturbed by the waves, aging, sickness, and death. I prostrate to the Arda triple gem. Thus I heard at one time, Bhagavan was dwelling on the Maastricht mountain in Rajgir, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagavan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories phenomenon called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Buddhisvara looked upon the very practice and profound faction of wisdom and beheld those five agates also as empty in nature. Then, to the power of the Buddha, Venvashariputra said to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Buddhisvara, how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice activities of profound faction of wisdom? He said that, and Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Buddhisvara said this to the Venvashariputra. Shariputra, and his son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice activities of profound faction of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeating beyond those five agates also in nature. Form is empty. Emptiness is form. Form is not than form. Form is not than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, composition of factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena emptiness without characteristics, unproduced, unceased, stillness without not filled, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, because in emptiness is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no composition of factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visible form, no sound, no organ, no taste, no object of touch, no phenomenon. There is no element, up till including no mind element and mental conscious element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, including aging and death, and extinction, aging and death. Similarly, there's no suffering, origination, cessation, and part. There's no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there's no attainment, bodhisattvas rely and dwell in perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. And all the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifest completely with beyond surprise, perfect in light, in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the mantra of the equal to unequal, the mantra to truly pacify all suffering should be known as the truth, since it's not false. The mantra of perfection of wisdom is declared, Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva should train the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagavan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Buddhisvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage, and just like that, just like that. On just practitioner of wisdom, just as you indicated, and you Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagavan having thus spoken, the Venvashariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Buddhisvara, and those surrounding there entirely, along with the worlds of gods, humans, asuras, Gandhava, overjoyed and highly spoken by Bhagavan. I prostrate to the king, the three chakras, who abide of the holy yoga and human space. By the powers of clairvoyance and mental emanation, look at the protection like a mother for a child. By the teachings of the Supreme Jewels, possessing the power of truth, may inner and outer be transformed. May it be dispelled, and may it be pacified. May all negative forces opposed to the Dharma be completely pacified, and may the host of 80,000 obstacles be pacified. And may we be separated from problems and harmful conditions to the Dharma. And may all enjoyments be according to the Dharma, and may there be auspicious and perfect happiness here and right now. The foundation of all qualities is the kind of perfect pure Guru. Correctly devoting to him is the root of the path. Like doing this and seeing great effort, please bless me to rely upon with great respect. Understanding precious freedom of this rebirth is found only once. It's greatly meaningful and difficult to find again. Please bless me to generate that mind as unceasingly day and night takes its essence. This life is impermanent as a water bubble. Remember how quickly it decays and death comes. After death, just like the shadow follows the body, the reason of black and white karma follow. Finding firm and definite conviction in this, please bless me always to be careful, to abandon even the slightest negativities and accomplish all virtuous deeds. Seeking samsaric pleasures is a door towards suffering. They are uncertain, cannot be relied upon. Recognize these shortcomings, please bless me. Strong wish for the bliss of liberation. Led by this pure thought, mindfulness, alertness, and great caution arise. The root of the teaching is keeping Pratyamoksha vows. Please bless me to accomplish this essential practice. Just as I have fallen into the sea of samsara, so have all modern migratory beings. Please bless me to see this, train the supreme bodhicitta, and be the responsibility of free migratory beings. Even if I develop only bodhicitta, but do not practice 3 types of morality, I will not achieve enlightenment. With my clear recognition of this, please bless me to generate and practice bodhisattva vows of great energy. Once I pacify distraction to wrong objects and correctly analyze the meaning of reality, please bless me to generate quickly in my mind stream the unified part of calm embodying special insight. Have become a pure vessel by training in a general path, please bless me to enter the holy gateway of the fortunate ones, the supreme Vajra vehicle. At a time, the basis of accomplishing the 2 attainments is keeping pure vows and samadhi. As I become firmly convinced of this, please bless me to protect these vows and pledge like my life. Then, having realized the importance of the 2 stages, the essence of the Vajrayana, by practicing with great energy, never giving up the 4 sessions, please bless me to realize the teaching of the Holy Guru. Like that, may the Gurus who show the noble paths and spiritual friends who practice it have long lives. Please bless me to pacify completely out in hindrance. In all my lives, never be separated from perfect Gurus, may I enjoy the magnificent Dharma. By completing quality of stages and paths, may I quickly attain the state of Vajradhara. Saji Joje Endo Dravirale Ji Ne Ye Pane San Ye Je De Me De Uvarhi Joyuna Da Shenga Jemaju Idam Guru Ram Kamne Yata Yami Sanye Chedan Sami Janju Badu Dani Yazaji Dagi Juju Gibe Sona Nola Penje Sangye Doba Jo Sangye Chedan Sami Janju Badu Dani Yazaji Dagi Juju Gibe Sona Dola Penje Sangye Doba Jo Sangye Chedan Sami Janju Badu Dani Yazaji Dagi Juju Gibe Sona Nola Penje Sangye Doba Jo Kangi Tuzin is a way Tawatan Japanchi, Tamachu Simple. Gotam de la Chase. Yeah, maybe to start with that quotation. One quotation by Arya Nagarjuna, of the chapter 27, if I'm right, praising the Buddha because of the teachings of dependent origination. Yeah, Nagarjuna says in that particular chapter, in one verse, to praise the Buddha for a particular teaching. Yeah, so that summarizes a little bit the Buddhist teachings and also very important aspects of what Nagarjuna saw as most important. So in that verse, it translates Kangi Tuzin is a way, it means it translates as you moved out of compassion. Yeah, that's the first line. You moved out of compassion, you will eliminate the wrong views. You teacher of the sublime Dharma, to Gautam Buddha I pay homage. So that's the verse Nagarjuna uses for praising the Buddha. So a few things are very interesting in this verse. That the Buddha is moved out of compassion, right? So that means the Buddha is completely motivated by the bodhicitta attitude. You know? And also that's one aspect why the Buddha is be considered in Buddhist practice as a valid person. Yeah, so Arya Nagarjuna's works, you can basically you can explain in secular or universal aspect. As we know, the Buddhist doctrine can be divided according to Holiness interpretation in a threefold division, right, of Buddhist science and psychology and Buddhist philosophy. Yeah, so there are two secular or universal aspects of the Buddhist doctrine. Yeah? So that can be studied by everyone, Buddhist practitioner or not. Yeah, so that's Buddhist mind science and its philosophy, so to say. So there's many chapters within the text of the fundamental wisdom that has these kind of threefold division as well. Yeah, the text we're dealing with today is kind of more in the context of Buddhist practice. Yeah? So that means that the Buddha moved out of compassion. Yeah, so that's one of the reasons why we see it as a valid person, according to the Brahmanavartika's second chapter, where it talks about why is the Buddha a person we can trust. Yeah, so one of the reasons is motivation, and the other reasons is teaching the ultimate nature of reality, and that we can analyze in many ways of logic, or even with modern findings in quantum mechanics, then we come to very similar conclusions as the Buddha did already 2,500 years ago. So the Buddha moved out of compassion. You eliminate wrong views. There's the second line, you know, the verse of Arya Nagarjuna's praise, and that's a verse referring to, or line referring to, that the Buddha eliminates wrong views of the destructive emotions, and in particular, the wrong view of ignorance. Yeah, so that's not that the Buddha eliminates individuals who the Buddha don't agree with, but the wrong forms of consciousness within the mind of that particular individual. It's true, right? The real enemy is not a person. The real enemy is the destructive emotions. The destructive emotions, that's our real kind of focus to abandon, or the afflictions, so to say. So you moved out of compassion, you eliminate wrong views. You're teacher of the sublime Dharma, you know, so meaning the third line is kind of the teaching of dependent origination. That's what Arya Nagarjuna saw as the most profound teaching. Why? Because the teaching on dependent origination helps us to eliminate ignorance, the root cause of all samsaric suffering, and the root cause of all our problems in life is rooted in this ignorance, of this apprehension of a self to exist independent all by itself. Yeah, so the Buddha talked about it already 2,500 years ago. Arya Nagarjuna, a few hundred years later, also talked about this, and we can see in modern society that you know, this form of self-importance and putting yourself more in front of others is not very constructive, as well as this grasping at a concrete from its own same existing self is not very constructive. And even David Bohm talks about it, you know, kind of physicist who comes to the same conclusions by the power of the language of, you know, mathematics and statistics, right? So the Buddha came, and Nagarjuna came to the conclusions by the power of the language of epistemology, but the result is the same. That David Bohm also said, this I, or this self, is just a show, right? And based on this self-importance, or this self-deceptive thought, as he calls it, people want security, they want power, they want money, and then there's a distinction between us and them, and that's why we have problems. Yeah, so that's not an uncommon view of Buddhism. You can see even David Bohm talks about it, and he says this self is just a show. It's just a show. It's not really there. It's a very similar conclusion, but he said it's a very convincing show, and that's why people take it as an apparent reality. It's quite interesting comment. Yeah. So the Buddha and Nagarjuna's works, they help us to eliminate this wrong view of the misunderstanding of reality, yeah, especially the ignorance being the first link of the 12 links. So Arya Nagarjuna wrote this text, Fundamental Wisdom, for a particular purpose, and well, for the purpose of basically eliminating or making clear, so to say, the teachings on emptiness were kind of degenerated a few hundred years after the Buddha's passing. And then the Buddha, passed away, and these teachings were degenerating. And then Arya Nagarjuna actually clarified many aspects of the teachings on emptiness in 6 kind of texts regards with logic, and 1 text regards with the quotations of the Buddha's sutras. And one of the 6 forms of the logical text is actually this text, the Fundamental Wisdom. And it's one of the most profound texts Arya Nagarjuna wrote. Arya Nagarjuna wrote also, next to philosophy, on Buddhist practice, like the letter for a friend, for example, is very Lamrim kind of style of teaching. Yeah, so the letter for a friend is a very kind of basic teaching on the Lamrim, right? This kind of instruction. And Arya Nagarjuna also wrote many inspiring kind of praises, in praise of Dharma Dhatu, in praise of the Vajra mind. Very interesting kind of text. Very short, but a very interesting text on praising certain aspects of the mind or praising certain aspects of reality. So he had kind of a threefold division of classical commentaries, like the text we're going to talk about, and then some instruction manuals like Letter for a Friend, Lamrim style kind of teachings. And Arya Nagarjuna also composed a lot of these kind of praises, with very pit instructions inside very short text. So that's a little bit of the history of Nagarjuna, who came, it depends on which research you depend upon, just let's say a few hundred years after the Buddha's passing. There's different interpretations. So Arya Nagarjuna came from South India, right? So His Holiness often indicates to people in South India to give them a bit of a boost, very good brains. So His Holiness tries to, let people come into this teaching, especially in India, where it all originated. So Arya Nagarjuna was also one of the great scholars of the Narayana tradition, as you know. And His Holiness Dalai Lama puts a lot of emphasis on Arya Nagarjuna's work, and especially this particular text. And His Holiness taught the text completely once in Drepung, the opening of Gomang Monastic Institution, and also on separate occasions, His Holiness took a few chapters, including the chapter we're going to do today, because it's kind of a very essential aspect of the Buddhist path. So the 12 links, that's what Arya Nagarjuna talks about in this chapter. And most of the chapters within the Fundamental Wisdom, it always relates back and forth to dependent origination and empty of inherent existence, right? Well, this chapter actually merely talks about, just the 12 links by themselves. If you have previous chapters or later chapters, like the Four Noble Truths, for example, everything is related with seeing the Four Noble Truths in the nature of interdependence and empty of inherent existence. Well, this chapter doesn't really talk about it that much. It's just a general presentation, or very short presentation, of the 12 links. And all the chapters, the Four Noble Truths, for example, are very interesting. I mean, all the chapters are very interesting. But we don't have time to do everything. So that's why a few chapters are selected, based mainly on what His Holiness mostly sees as most important, if you want to cut things down. That's in the West. There's a bit people looking for shortcuts or easy approach, quick enlightenment, but without too much effort. That's what we want in the West. So a few chapters are very interesting. So I've been asked to explain chapter 26, and that talks about the 12 links. And after that, chapter 18, which talks about emptiness. Chapter 18 is the essence of the whole Fundamental Wisdom. Chapter 18 is summarizing everything that comes before it, and actually also condensing everything that comes after it. And so chapter 18 is the essence of the whole text. It's very short, but it actually explains all forms of the selflessness of the self of a person, as well the selflessness of the self of phenomena. And all the sevenfold reasoning of Chandrakirti, for example, which is based on particular sutra quotations, right? That has been also summarized in a very structured way in a few verses in chapter 18. So that's the essence of the whole text. And we're going to do that next month, right? I think, yeah. So today we're going to talk about the 12 links. So the text is very structured, you know, so we can see that. And so we have to know the origin of the 12 links, that the 12 links came into being by the Buddha's teaching on interdependence. And then also the Buddha said, if you understand interdependence in this way, then you understand, or you see the Dharma, the Buddha said. Seeing dependent origination means seeing the Dharma. If you see the Dharma, you see the Buddha. So that means you come closer to Buddhahood. That's the meaning behind it. And that's also the importance of understanding dependent origination. Then the different references of the 12 links, as we know, the Shalu Sprout Sutra or the Vinaya Sutra, yeah, they talk about the 12 links. Yeah, that gives us an idea of how we are born within samsara and how we can get out. That's two aspects to the 12 links, right? There's kind of the way we enter samsara, the sequence we normally study the 12 links, and the way how to get out of samsara, meaning if the first link is not there, the second link doesn't come into being, etc., etc. And so there's two aspects there. So those two aspects are important because the first verse number 1 until including verse number 9 talks about how we enter in samsara. And so verse 1 and 2, including verse number 9, talks about how we enter into samsaric rebirth. The last few verses, right, 10, 11, and 12, they talk about how to get out of samsara. So that's the structure of the chapter, how we are bound within samsara and how we get out of samsara. Yeah, so that's, and then getting out of samsara, the last three verses, that actually is perfect at that time to talk about emptiness. So that's why we decided to do first 26, chapter 26, and then chapter 18. Yeah, so that's emptiness. And then after that, we meet again one day, and then we go over the emptiness of the Buddha. So we have kind of samsara, a little bit of emptiness, and then nirvana in the context of non-abiding nirvana of Buddhahood. So we, yeah, actually complete very important points of the path. So that's very fortunate to discuss those things. So the 12 links, as I just said, during the motivation can also be divided or be practiced in the three scopes of the Lamrim, right? So that we have in the Lamrim Chemo, for example, Lama Tsongkhapa's great exposition of the stage of path to enlightenment, then Lama Tsongkhapa quotes from Gyaltsab Chenpo Buchungwa, which is kind of the virtuous friends, Buchungwa, one of the Kadampa masters, and who actually said that the 12 links can be studied in the three levels of the scopes of the practitioners of the three levels of the Lamrim, right? That we can understand the three scopes better if you understand the 12 links. Because if you wish a precious human rebirth in the future, you have to practice morality, as we know, being the main cause for precious human rebirth, right? Morality and making statements, prayers together with some other practitioners like generosity, etc. Yeah. So morality helps us to eliminate negative deeds. Yeah. So meaning the small scope is focused upon not to be born in lower states of existence. So, and that's exactly, you have to know the 12 links for that purpose, because if you create negative karma, and the negative karma is complete in the sense of 4 factors, as we talk about in karma, yeah, the basis, intention, the deed, and the final step. If all those factors are complete, then in the context of the 12 links, it has the power or potential to throw you in another state of rebirth at a time of death, right? So that's why studying the 12 links is very important at the level of the small scope. Yeah, to strive for precious human rebirth, you have to know the process, right? You have to know the process of rebirth. So we don't have time to go over that aspect of rebirth and reincarnation, but yeah, it's quite essential in this teaching because it talks about the links being completed in a minimum of 2 lifetimes, right? So it's kind of, yeah, and those people who still question this existence of rebirth, and you have to analyze and see what are the reasons for it to exist and what are the reasons for it not to exist. And there's a lot of evidence, even in the scientific world, of consciousness without brain activity, so to say, in the near-death experience, when a person is passing away, has a cardiac arrest, and the person is brought back to life. Then in the in-between period, when the cardiac arrest is there, within 10 to 20 seconds, oxygen flow to the brain stops and the person is brain dead. And it's a very controlled environment we can measure, right? It's kind of, we can measure if there's brain activity or not at that particular time. But there's a lot of evidence that people see things or know things in that in-between period. And when they come back to life, we can validate it. If they don't come back to life, there's no way to validate it, right? But when they come back to life, what they saw, we can validate. And that's a lot of scientific backup in the near-death experience to prove that what people see in that in-between state, when the EEG goes flat, where there's no brain activity, most neuroscientists will say, yeah, oxygen flow to the brain stops. People see all kinds of things. But if you look at the documentation of what people actually see, and you analyze that depends on which research you depend. About Bruce Grayson, who's quite famous in the US in his research, or Pim van Lommern here in Europe from the Netherlands, did a lot of research as a cardiologist, for example. Yeah. Then they come to figures of 80 to 90% what people perceive is valid. And there's no brain activity, right? So that proves there is consciousness without a physical brain that has perception. And if that perception is valid, then something is going on, something very interesting. Anyway, that's for yourself to research. There's a lot of interesting presentations you can find on YouTube, presentations of Bruce Grayson, for example, from the University of Wisconsin, if I'm right, or Virginia, yeah. Or Pim van Lommern from the Netherlands, who did a lot of research. Anyway, there's a lot of, or Sam Pranya is from the University of Southampton, but also connected with the University of New York. Yeah, so Sam Pranya, yeah, so Sam Pranya is also a professor at the University of New York, actually, and he did a lot of research regarding the near-death experience. It's a very interesting aspect of consciousness being, not only active, but perceiving valid things when there's no physical brain. So it's very interesting. So that's the question. Then we have also interesting aspects of other points of brain damage or tumor in the brain, that people get really distracted, get into a coma, for example, or people are very confused when they talk with family members. But just before death comes, sometimes a few hours, sometimes a few days, clarity comes back to the mind like before. Well, the brain structure is exactly the same. And so that's also, it's not that many cases, not that many of us need that experience, but there are cases like that. And it's very interesting. Why is it possible that there's clarity to the mind where the brain structure is the same as in the coma and brain tumor or some other damage that has been done? So it's very interesting that clarity comes back to the mind. And in the Buddhist forms of the spiritual part of the Vajrayana, especially, we talk about that the clear-light minds dance before you actually leave your body, right? That the mind becomes more subtle. The coarser forms of consciousness cease to exist, and the subtler consciousness become more manifest. And that's exactly what happened in a near-death experience, and that's exactly what happened when a person is close to death, right? So that proves to a certain extent, or gives a reason, that this is possible, according to this interpretation, that the mind becomes more, it doesn't depend that much anymore on a physical brain, because the subtler the mind becomes, the less dependence on a physical brain. And that goes then all the way to the full extent of going from one life to the next lifetime, because then, the coarser forms of consciousness, they cease to exist, and only subtle consciousness is left. And the subtle consciousness, what we say in the Buddhist interpretation, goes from one life to the other. It's very interesting, because if you study children remembering previous lifetime, another professor from the US, right, Professor Stevenson, or his student, because Stevenson passed away a few years ago, but now his student Jim Tucker is taking up the research and also has a very interesting YouTube presentations and even on Netflix, right, you guys? US has Netflix, I suppose. Yeah, I was introduced to Netflix just quite recently, in the sense of knowing that it's there. I never really watched it, but it's there anyway. So there even you can find a series on surviving death, it's called. Yeah, so Jem Tucker is a very interesting documentary there about American children, even remembering previous personalities. And it's quite hardcore statistics in the sense that there's a young child, one of the cases in this particular video he made, just they pointed down 200 facts of his previous personality, which could not be known because he never met the persons of the previous life, right? So they checked, and then a lot of those things were valid. And he knew things about people you cannot just know by any other means, right? So it's very interesting. Yeah, and Stevenson's research was even stronger because Stevenson's research also worked with birthmarks of the cause of death, showing a birthmark in new rebirth. So if there's a person dies from a shot wound or a bullet, right? Most cases of people who die and remember in previous lifetimes, they die straight away, not in a sickness slowly, but they die just in an accident or being murdered, or because then there's a possibility to remember is much stronger present, right? According to the Buddhist interpretation, that there's no slow decay of the sensory perceptions. It just happens like that, and then to remember things is easier. So that makes sense. So then in Stevenson's research, there's a combination of children remembering previous lifetimes as well as a birthmark of the cause of death of the previous personality. It's very interesting because I looked at a few cases. So you look at the University of Virginia, they produced a few thick books about the case studies. It's not easy to get, but very interesting material. That the cause of death of the previous personality, for example, a shot wound. So they have the police report of the shot wound, right? And then the child remembering things of the previous personality that can be validated. And then the child has the birthmark exactly according to the photo of the police report of the previous personality. So very interesting material. And there's about 2,000 cases, over 40 years being examined. So it's not something small. And if you put statistics to it, having studied a bit of statistics myself in my studies of hydrology, then it's quite significant. Yeah, there must be something there. You cannot otherwise explain it. So what Stevenson says is there is something that carries the information from a previous personality to the present. It's a very interesting comment. He said, I'm not proving reincarnation, but there is something like that. Yeah? So that proves what we call as Buddhism, the continuity of consciousness. Yeah. So, I mean, if you're very interested in that, there's another American. So I keep it all in the American line because that's where I come from. Not Jim Tucker. Schroeder. Schroeder, he was a New York-based journalist, and he wrote one book, Old Souls. Right? So he was very critical about this whole research, and he talked to Professor Stevenson and told him, "Can I see it, or I want to just know about it? I don't believe it." And then Stevenson said, "Okay, you can travel with me for a few months," and he did, I think, 1 or 2 months. So Schroeder, he traveled. He was in the beginning. He said in his own book, Old Souls. He says that I was very critical, but there is no other way to explain this other than there must be something between two lives. Very interesting. So he was kind of a journalist who came with Stevenson and very critical initially, and then saw the evidence and said, okay, there's no other way to explain it otherwise. So very interesting. Anyway, so that's a little bit for us important, Buddhist practitioner, especially to get more convinced about past and future lifetimes, right? Because the whole Buddhist doctrine, starting with the small scope, already talks about resume rebirth, right? So it's quite important. Anyway, that's not the topic of today, otherwise we don't have enough time. So that's for your homework to examine these points, if it's true or not. Yeah? Analyze. So that's a small scope, according to this spiritual friend Buchungwa. But Buchungwa also said, as in most of the Lamrims, is being explained at the level of the middle scope, right? That we have to understand suffering samsara and how to get out of it. That's why Most Lamrims, they talk about the 12 links in the middling scope. Yeah. Then also in the great scope, Buchuma says is important in order to understand suffering and to generate great compassion for sentient beings, to see them wandering around in samsara and generate a wish for them to be free of suffering. Yeah, so that's why also the 12 links can be studied and meditated upon in the great scope to generate more compassion for others who are stuck in samsara. Yeah. Okay, so that's a little bit of the introduction towards the 12 links. And then the 12 links, yeah, in this text is very clear. It's just actually a summary of the points. Yeah, so then we go to the text. So that means that the first 3 links, that's maybe another important, another aspect of the overview, right? Before we actually start is, you know, we have things that cause suffering and we have results, and we come to that later. But ignorance, the mind that apprehends an I am mine or thinks there's a concrete I, yeah, that causes destructive emotions to come up like anger, attachment, jealousy, pride, and also new forms of depression, anxiety, fear, low self-esteem, shame. You know, it's all rooted in this concept of I am mine. It's all rooted in a kind of apprehension of a self to think that exists from its own side. And that self that looks to exist from its own side is this ignorance, is this first link, right? One aspect of it. So that's kind of what we say the farmer, yeah, who's going to plant something, this ignorance. Yeah? So then because of ignorance, we generate anger, we generate attachment, jealousy, pride, you know. So we act mentally. And based on that mental activity, we have physical and verbal behaviors. And that can be either positive or negative, depending on our mental attitudes. Yeah? So that's activity or karma. So here you see there's ignorance, yeah, that causes a particular affliction or destructive emotion to come about. And then there we have activity. Yeah, karma is basically the meaning is activity, right? So activity of physical, verbal, and mental behaviors. That's what karma is all about. Yeah. So that means that ignorance is the farmer, karma is kind of the seed, right? So the second link in the 12 links, the first link is actually the farmer, the second link is the seed, yeah? And then the ground you put the seed in is consciousness, link number 3, right? So you have the first 3 links already summarized there, that ignorance causes us to create different types of karma, either positive or negative. We come to that. And that leaves an imprint or potential in our mind. Yeah? And that is planted in our consciousness. So consciousness is be considered as a field, right? And karma, the seeds of karma are the seeds. Yeah? So that's the farmer. Then those seeds are planted in your consciousness, right? Or in the field of consciousness. So then they come to ripening at a level of craving, grasping, and becoming. Yeah, there's a few links down the line. Then we talk about craving, grasping, and becoming, right? Yeah. So 8, 9, and 10, you know. So craving, grasping, and becoming, they're actually the heat and moisture and the fertilization. They activate these seeds at a time of death, and they cause us to be reborn in either high states of rebirth or low states of rebirth. You see? So it's all rooted in this ignorance, and then it creates karma, and then this karma leaves potentials in our continuity of consciousness that get activated at a particular time, and that causes rebirth. Yeah, but also in day-to-day life, it's very similar, right? When this strong I comes up, when we get angry, or strong desire comes up, or attachment, or jealousy, or pride, or, you know, it's kind of a very strong I that looks to appear in a particular way, and we think it exists in that way, but actually the question is, does it exist the way it appears? The way it appears causes a problem, because the way it appears, then we say me, them, my, this, you know, then we generate kind of attachment and aversion based on this, and we come to that. So that's a few aspects of ignorance that causes these destructive emotions to arise, that motivates us in activity. You know, for example, killing is an activity based often, not always, but based on often on anger. So that means that a person has a negative thought of anger and motivates the person to kill. Yeah, so you can see one of my friends who became a friend later on, before we didn't know each other, but when I want to give talks in the Central Prison in Bangalore, it was very interesting. It's a very different prison than prisons in the US, I tell you. Because when you go inside, you go to a few doors, heavy doors, but then you come inside and it's like a park. In this particular prison, it's like there's no armed police, only police walking with a stick, that's it. And there's very free walking around. And they do low yoga and all kind of activities with the prisoners. So I went there to conduct a few talks with very young prisoners, inmates. And then the translator, who was translating in the local language of that state, Canada, you know, then he was there for murder. He was there already for 12 years. You know, it's like his home. So, and he made a very interesting comment. He's a very nice person to talk to. You know, he killed another person, but that doesn't mean they are bad, right? That means they have also other qualities of mind we don't see when they kill others. So he said something very interesting. He said, for 10, 15 minutes, I was not in control. I made a mistake. So that means that by the power of anger, he committed the crime of murder, right? But deep inside, he didn't actually want to do that, but he was in this emotional hijack of anger, right? And rooted in ignorance. I don't like this person. I want to be separated from this person. And so that you can see the correlation between mind, ignorance, and physical behavior in this case. Yeah. So that's a little bit of the introduction of the 12 links. So the farmer is like the ignorance, like the farmer. Karma is like the seed. Yeah. Consciousness is like the ground or the fields we plant. And then link number 8, 9, and 10, yeah, craving, grasping, and becoming, they're actually like the heat, moisture, and fertilization because they activate it. It's true, right? If we have a negative thoughts, then we activate more negative thoughts. It becomes a kind of a pattern, you know. So whatever state of mind that comes into being, that activates previous habituations. And that's why it's always very important at the time of death to have a very virtuous or very positive state of mind. Yeah, and that's why we try to help others to generate that. And if they're not Buddhist, then we try not to talk about Buddhism, of course. We just try to help them in a way if they're spiritual or if they, whatever generates a kind of positive attitude in their mind, we try to help them. Yeah. Okay, so that's a little bit of the outline of the text. So then we go to the first verse. Yeah, so there it talks about 3 links. Yeah, so in the first line it says, the obscuring ignorance propels one into samsaric birth. So this ignorance propels in the sense of we have activity based on ignorance and that causes birth. So ignorance is link number 1 and birth is link number 11. Right? So that means that here already the correlation is being made between link number 1 and the potential of creating birth, right? Because the whole 12 links talks about it. Yeah. So yeah, so ignorance has different types of ignorance. We know the different schools of Buddhist philosophy describe ignorance in various ways. And so to summarize it all, then, for example, ignorance, one aspect of ignorance of negative karma is, for example, not believing in law of cause and effect. If you don't believe in law of cause and effect, that even on a worldly level, prevents you from changing. Yeah, if you think, oh, I'm always the same, I will be always the same, then you will never change. If you have a problem, you think, oh, I have this problem and we always have this problem, then we never solve it. Yeah, that means that problems are not really, you know, existing from its own side, and they're changeable. Our brain is even changeable. Yeah, we know in the last 2 decades, we learned about neuroplasticity, that we can change the brain. Train your mind, train your brain, right? So that means that this possibility for change is there. If you don't believe in that, then it becomes very complicated. If you don't believe in the continuity of states of mind, that one particular state of mind, like anger, produces suffering, and a constructive form of emotion like compassion, love, and kindness produces happiness. If you don't believe in that kind of cause and effect relationship, then it causes an incredible obstacle, right? And that's why we say it's kind of a non-virtuous, because it causes you to suffer more. Yeah, so that's why that type of ignorance of not believing in law of cause and effect, yeah, is kind of a cause for negative karma to be created. Then with positive karma, because the 12 links also talk about positive karma to be reborn within cyclic existence, then this negative state of mind of not believing in cause and effect will not be able to be present, because you have to create something positive karma, right? So then, but then the other form of ignorance, the ignorance of when you, for example, do an online donation to a good organization, right, is virtuous, right? But still, we always think my money goes to them. Yeah, we always see the three things: I, the donation, and the person we donate to, it's to, organization we donate to, it's to. We always see them as very concrete, existing from their own side. And so that aspect actually makes the virtue what we call contaminated. Yeah, because it's contaminated by the power of misunderstanding reality. Yeah, so that's kind of the awesome type of ignorance. With virtue, we create, for example, if we create the practice human rebirth, with practicing morality, as being the main reason or the main cause, then when we practice morality, then also we have always the apprehension of a concrete I am I, right? So that causes that morality, which is virtuous and can propel you another future state of rebirth, positive state of rebirth, but still is contaminated. And that's why our body and mind are contaminated, right? And all the feelings we have, even pleasure, is contaminated, is not everlasting. Because the cause is contaminated, so the result is contaminated. Yeah, you see that? So ignorance has many aspects. Ignorance has an aspect of, in the 12 links, right? There's many types of ignorance. Ignorance actually means not knowing. Ma ripa in Tibetan. Ripa means to know. Ma is a negative, right? So not knowing, meaning not understanding. There's many levels. Also, you don't know how this hall looks like on that side, right? You don't know that. There's also a form of ignorance, but there's not an ignorance that really disturbs us, unless we get really annoyed and really want to know what's there. But other than that, it's not really a difficult one to disturb our mind. So that's not the ignorance we're talking about here. Here we talk about the ignorance that can propel you in lower states of existence, like not believing in law of cause and effect, or ignorance that can propel you in positive states of rebirth, which is motivated by this grasping or apprehension of an I and mine to exist from its own side. Yeah, so, and that's why all the things are contaminated. Yeah, there's many things. We can actually spend many hours on the first link if you want to. Yeah, so there's many aspects of ignorance in the four schools of Buddhist philosophy, for example, but we don't have enough time to do that all. But it's very interesting because the Prasangika says something, as we know, main view of Arya Nagarjuna is the Prasangika view of the transitory collection, right? The ignorance that focuses upon body and mind and apprehends an I and mind to exist inherently. And that's the real important ignorance to be understood. Yeah? And there's also the ignorance in relation to that one. In the Prasangika, we talk about what is the root of samsara. Yeah, so that is an ignorance that apprehends the self of a person or self of phenomena. Both actually are the roots of samsara in the Prasangika view, right? But here in the 12 links, we don't really need the root of samsara to be present. It can also be just not believing in law of cause and effect to create negative karma to be born in a low state of existence, right? So that should be clear. So the ignorance here in the 12 links is a kind of particular one that can have negative forms of motivate negative forms of behavior, of not believing in law of cause and effect, for example, and also can motivate positive behavior by the power of thinking you exist from your own side. Yeah, and that can be different levels. That can be inherent existence, or sometimes those who have studied tenets, they know if to relate to. It can also be an ignorance of seeing a self that exists permanent, unitary, and autonomous, or a self-sufficient existing self. Self-sufficient, substantial, self-sufficient, substantial existing self. Yeah, Rangitubezeer. So there can be many types, right? This ignorance can have many, many aspects, right? Yeah. So that's in short the ignorance. But it depends also on which school of Buddhist philosophy you explain the 12 links. You can explain the 12 links according to Vaibhasika, according to Sautantrika, according to mind only, according to the Madhyamaka. Yeah, so every school can explain. And then the main difference is about ignorance and consciousness and a few other aspects of what is actually. Anyway, we don't have time for that. It's very interesting, and you can explain the 12 links also from the point of view of the sutra, as well as from the highest yoga tantra. So there's many possibilities with the 12 links. Yeah? So today we just have a general kind of approach. Yeah. So that's the first line and first verse, right? So this obscuring ignorance propels one into samsaric birth. Yeah. So ignorance motivates action or karma that comes into consciousness by the power of craving, grasping, and becoming. It gets activated and causes you to be born. Yeah, that's in the first line of the first verse already. It actually summarizes all the 12 links. Then the second line, it says the 3 compositional factors, yeah, enhance the formation of birds. So what are the 3 compositional factors? Here, the term compositional factors is the term of the mental factor intention. Right? And those who have studied mind and mental factors, they know the mental factor intention. The function is to engage in virtue, non-virtue, or in the unspecified or the neutral activities. Yeah, so here it's referring to the mental factor intention in the kasa, in the mental factors. Yeah, that means that function of that particular mental factor is to engage in either virtue, non-virtue, or unspecified. Yeah, or sometimes we translate as neutral. Yeah, specified. So here there's 3 aspects, right? That's what it says. The 3 compositional factors. So that means virtue, the 3 compositional factors mean a compositional factor in relation with virtue, a compositional factor in relation with non-virtue, and a compositional factor in relation with the unspecified. Yeah, or the neutral aspect. Yeah. That's one interpretation, but you can also think about the 3 activities of body, speech, and mind. Right? That's another interpretation you can find back in commentaries. That one is a threefold division of virtue, non-virtue, and neutral. But another interpretation can be the 3 compositional factors of the activities of body, speech, and mind. Right? Yeah, because ignorance motivates that. And in between ignorance and karma, we have sometimes the afflictions that play a role in negative karma. Yeah. So there's different interpretations possible. But most commentaries, they agree upon that the 3 compositional factors, the compositional factor here is referring to this kind of mental intention. Yeah, that mental factor that has a function to engage in virtue, non-virtue, or unspecified. Yeah. Okay. So then it says it enhances formation of birth. Yeah. These actions. Yeah, so when it says these actions in the last line of verse number 1, then actions is link number 2, right? Karmic formation, sometimes we call it, right? So impel one into the states of migrators. So that means we create an act, yeah, and that act is motivated by ignorance, and this act is what we call action. Yeah, that's the second word in the last line of the verse number 1. Yeah, karmic formation. Yeah, and then in verse number 2, it talks about the next 2 links. So having compositional as a condition. So having this virtue, non-virtue, or unspecified, right, action or karma, then it says that stops, right? That leaves an imprint in consciousness. Yeah, so how does that work? Similar way, if you look at a screen and you see people on the screen, then you look to the wall or whatever you have on your left or right, you look, then your consciousness of seeing the screen stops, right? Yeah, that stops. If you close your eyes, you can still remember the screen. So that means, why can you remember? Because your consciousness that perceived the screen before, your eye consciousness, stops, but that doesn't mean it completely disappears. There is what we call a potential left in the continuity of consciousness that causes us to remember. And this is very interesting, because in main forms of cognitive science, memory is very difficult to explain. So, but in Buddhist psychology, especially if you go a little bit more depth in chapter 7 of this text, it's very inspiring. Then it talks about disintegratedness. Yeah, just keep track of that when you read the chapter. It's not easy to be understood, but it's very interesting, especially Lama Tsongkhapa's interpretation of it. That means that if an action or particular consciousness, like looking at the screen, and you look somewhere else. That consciousness that you looked at the screen stops, right? But that doesn't mean it completely disappears. Lama Tsongkhapa says there's a kind of the disintegratedness is still present. And that is actually the potential to remember. And with karmic seeds, same thing. It's not that we do an act, that act stops, right? Act of murder, for example, you kill a person, and then the act is over, right? So that leaves a potential in your mind to experience something in the future, either being imprisoned or being killed yourself or something like that, right? So that's cause and effect relationship there, right? So that means that there is something left behind, right? It's not the action stops, so it leaves something behind. So often we say it's a karmic seed. That's not mostly how we define it in most forms of Buddhist philosophy. But actually what Lama Tsongkhapa said is just the stopping of that act by itself doesn't mean it disappears. The disintegratedness, or that what is left at the time of disintegration, remains there until the result is met. It's very interesting. Anyway, that's for those who study a bit more. And that's very interesting aspect of chapter number 7, for example, of this text. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, we don't have enough time to. It's very inspiring chapters in this text, actually. It's very true. Yeah. So having compositional as a condition, it says consciousness enters transmigration, because consciousness is this field, right, where these imprints are planted. Yeah? So same as we look at the screen, you look at the wall, your consciousness stops of seeing the screen, but you can remember, right? If you close your eyes, you can remember. So that means that imprint is planted in consciousness, right? So with every form of perception, we can remember later on. Sometimes we forget things, but there's a possibility to remember, right? So nothing is lost, so to say. Yeah, it's very interesting. Sometimes you don't remember when we were 5 years old at the 20th of June. What did we do? You remember? You don't remember, right? But when you get, for example, clairvoyance by the power of calm abiding, you can remember. So that means it is not lost. That information is not lost. Yeah, we just have an obscuration not to know it. That's what it is. You know, it's very interesting. There's one person who accomplished calm abiding, one layperson, one student of Theo Kyoma Rinpoche, one of the great masters of Tibet. And he came after His Holiness also to India, and he taught in course. And then one person got calm abiding in quite a short period of time. And he started remembering things so vividly, that the little colors on the toys he was playing with, and then he started remembering previous lifetimes, and then he started knowing what other people in the other huts were thinking. It's very interesting. So that means that information is not lost, right? So that means this kind of, and that's very interesting for us, because from a karmic point of view, it makes a lot of sense that seeds are planted and those seeds are not lost. They leave a potential to come to ripening in a future state of existence or in a future period. And then when we activate it, we can, it becomes activated, right? So yeah. Anyway, there's a few small things to think about it. Yeah, so these actions impel the state of migrators, having composition as a condition. It says consciousness enters migration, because consciousness in this particular general presentation is kind of the place where all these seeds are planted. Yeah, so generally speaking, Prasangika would say the mere collection of the aggregates. Yeah, that's what go on, and that's where the seeds are planted. Yeah, the mind only says the mind basis of all is what goes, and all the seeds are planted in there. So there's different interpretations. So yeah, we think consciousness goes from this life to the next life. So all those seeds and potentials are in consciousness. Yeah. So that means consciousness enters transmigration. Once consciousness has entered, you know, then name and form come into being. So that means at a time, there's two levels of consciousness here. One consciousness at the time of the action, and one consciousness at the time of the result. Yeah, so our consciousness stream goes from today until enlightenment is achieved, right? So that means that consciousness of a particular act, as we now, for example, you look at the screen, yeah, you look at the wall, so then the consciousness having seen the screen stops, right? Leaves the imprint in your consciousness. Then tomorrow you think, who was on the screen again? Oh yeah, this person, this person, this person, right? So tomorrow you remember. Yeah, so that's the consciousness of today is the consciousness of where the seeds are planted. The consciousness of tomorrow remembering is the consciousness at the time of the result, right? So that's two types there. It's, yeah, sometimes also explained in the 12 links. Yeah. And then if you die and you reborn, then we have name and form, so to say. Yeah, so name meaning consciousness and form meaning the physical aggregates. Yeah, so name talks about, we have 5 aggregates, right? Or not? 5 aggregates, and how many of those 5 are consciousness and how many are form? 1 is form and 4 are consciousness, right? So this form of consciousness, there's a collection, so that's why they call it name, right? Name, yeah. So, and then form of our physical aggregates. Yeah, so that's 1. So name and form come into being. That means the rebirth of a body and a mind. That's what it is, right? Yeah, yeah. So that comes into being. Once name and form come to be, it says in verse number 3, then the sense sources come into being. Yeah, so the 6 sense sources. So it means we have 5 sensory perceptions, right? Eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body, right? Yeah, so we have 5 sensory perceptions. Yeah? And we have mental consciousness, number 6. So in Buddhist psychology, the main emphasis is on mental consciousness because that talks about our development. Yeah? And in more forms of cognitive science in the West, we mostly focus on the sensory perception because mental consciousness is very difficult. Why is it very difficult? Because it is not form. That's why it's difficult. It has a correlation with the brain, but it's not the same as the brain. Yeah, and as we just saw with the near-death experience or the other aspects of one consciousness goes from one personality to the next, right? That means that, yeah, consciousness is not form, right, in Buddhist psychology. But it has a correlation with form. In a sense, it has a correlation with the physical brain. There's very interesting research being done between the correlation of the two, especially in the OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, kind of researchers, especially Jeffrey Schwartz, very interesting personality, who did a very interesting research regarding the correlation between consciousness and brain activity in the case of OCD. You know, anyway, it's interesting. So yeah, so here name and form, meaning there's consciousness and there is kind of a physical form. Yeah, so the 4 aggregates of feeling, discrimination, composition of factors, and consciousness fall into the category of name, right? And our physical body falls in the category of form. Yeah. So they are there. And because of having that, the 6 senses are there. Yeah. Meaning we have sense powers, right? The eye, optic nerve and the eyeball and things related with it. It is a physical aspect. Yeah. So when the baby or the fetus starts to develop, then these kind of organs start to grow, right? And then when they come out of the womb, then everything functions, all of them functions, right? Then, yeah, so that means that the 6 sense sources come into being, right? That's what it says. Yeah. So depending on the 6 sources, contact comes. Yeah, contact comes by coming in contact with the objects. Our consciousness comes into contact with objects. Yeah, so because of that contact, then feeling arises. As you know, contact and feeling are kind of omnipresent mental factors. We cannot escape those mental factors. They're always present. Yeah, so that is kind of contact comes into being. Yeah, yeah. So maybe we just break, have a breath, or breathing, or something, or just relax and look at something else in the screen. They say in the UK, I don't know, in probably the same. They say 20-20-20, meaning 20 minutes on 20 minutes screen time, then 20 seconds looking at 20 feet. Yeah, yeah, that's kind of a standard. So maybe we break for 7 minutes. Is okay? Yeah, yeah, because because on the clock here, yeah, it's okay. Then it's exactly. Oh, then I have to think what time is it? So your time.
Yes, thank you. 7 minutes so that we come back at 11:16.
Okay, yeah, or 11:15. Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, just relax a little bit. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Roll in. We can still we can still do something with feeling. You know, that means that yeah, we can prevent from judging, so to say, just observing what's going on, yeah? Observing the aspect of a feeling of pleasure or aspect of feeling of suffering, you know, without actually getting attached or getting aversion. Yeah? So that we can play with, yeah? But the actual feeling itself we cannot prevent. So that's an interesting point. So yeah, context unwavering comes into being, you know, and it says in verse number 4 how we come into contact with an object. And it's very interesting, right? From those who have studied about mind and awareness, for example, then you can relate to that, because it says, in verse number 4, it says, arisen is only dependent upon, it says three things there, I, form, and attention in our text, in our translation. Yeah. So here, attention is maybe not the right translation term. I would prefer to say recollection, yeah, because it's actually, it says in Tibetan, Denje, Dembar Jeba, means to recollect, you know. So upon I, form, and instead of attention, if you say recollection, it makes more sense. Yeah, so what happens there is that the I, yeah, we have 5 sensory perceptions, right? So one of the 5 sensory perceptions is the eye. That's taken as an example. So the eye is the eyeball, or the objective nerve is kind of what we call the sense power, the uncommon sense power of the eye. Yeah, so that is the what we say the dagyen, or the, yeah, we often translate it as the uncommon empowering condition, as we often say. Yeah, the empowering condition, the physical eyeball or the physical optic nerve. Yeah, so that's upon the eye. Then form is actually the object, or the observed condition, sometimes we translate. Yeah, the object that has been observed. Yeah, so that's called the observed condition. That is the form. Yeah, so, or the color and the shape of the screen, or the color and the shape of your computer. Yeah, that is the object of your eye consciousness, right? Yeah. So, and recollection, yeah, this attention, which actually is recollection, is the what we call the demetakian, means the directly preceding moment of consciousness. Consciousness comes only into being because there's a previous moment of consciousness, right? That also proves one aspect of the continuity of consciousness. There's a continuity of consciousness only possible because there's a previous moment producing the next one. Yeah, so that also proves that we cannot find a beginning of the continuity of consciousness, because every moment of consciousness is preceded by a previous moment. That preceded moment is preceded by its previous moment, and that by its previous moment, that by its previous, and we cannot find a beginning. And that's also how we prove, in one aspect of proof of reincarnation, of the continuity of consciousness, right? And that also goes into the future. We cannot stop the continuity of consciousness in the continuum of one particular person. Yeah, that goes all the way up to enlightenment, although the contaminated aspects of our consciousness, right, the aspects of the afflictions, the faults of our consciousness, right, that can be taken away. But actually the nature of consciousness can never be taken away. That the continuity of consciousness is there until Buddhahood has been achieved. So here, the previous moment of consciousness is present, yeah, and that causes this point of attention or recollection. Yeah? So it means a directly preceding moment of consciousness. Yeah. So thus, dependent on name and form, consciousness is produced. That's what it says, you know, because you have a physical body, and that implies the physical sense powers, right? And we have consciousness that needs those physical sense powers, because without an eyeball, you cannot see. Without an eardrum, you cannot hear properly, right? So it needs a kind of sense power which is physical, although consciousness is not physical, but it depends on that. Yeah. So that's what it says here. Thus, depending on name and form, consciousness is produced. Yeah, that means that you have a body and a mind. That means you have sense sources, and you have the consciousness. That means an object because of contact with that object, and then the correlation between object and object observer is being established, right? Yeah, that's what it says here. Consciousness is produced because without an object, there's no consciousness. Even our mental consciousness, when we think about things, then the object is called this mental image, right? The meaning generality. Yeah, so this mental image, if you close your eyes, before you close, you look at the screen, you see the color and shape. The color and the shape of the screen is the object of your eye consciousness, right? So then when you close your eyes and you think about the screen, the object of your mental consciousness, which is conceptual, it's a thought, is this mental image or meaning generality. Yeah, you see that? So there's no consciousness without object. Even if you have consciousness that's experiencing itself, then the object is consciousness itself, right? Yeah, so there's no consciousness without an object, so to say. Yeah. So here it talks about that consciousness produced because of meeting a particular object. Yeah. So that is assembled from the three. So here it talks about the three we just discussed, right? The physical sense power, the object, yeah, or what you call the observed condition, as well as the recollection aspect of the directly preceding moment of consciousness. When those three are being assembled together, then I form and consciousness is contact, right? So that means the contact with the object appears or arises, so to say. Yeah. And from contact arises feeling in verse number 5. So feeling comes, right, when we see an object or we hear an object or we think about an object, then there's a feeling with that. That feeling is always present with every type of consciousness. Sometimes it's more dormant, sometimes it's more manifest, right? But there's always a kind of feeling, the mental fact of feeling. So that feeling we cannot prevent, as we just talked about. Yeah? But we can prevent ourselves from engaging or from judging or from making comments or from getting either irritated or not getting irritated. Yeah, that we can still is in mind training, we can control that. That there's feeling we cannot control because feeling is an omnipresent mental factor. Yeah, so that means it's always present. Yeah. And then also it helps us to understand that the sense sources, right, especially the 5 senses, also sometimes when you study the wheel of life in relation with this text, and you know there's the 12 links in the outer circle, yeah, and then the senses often indicated by the house with the empty with the windows, so to say, with 6 windows, right? So that means the openings, and sometimes certain texts they talk about the doors of suffering. Why? Because sensory perception, actually, we think we can get happiness out of that, but actually it's not. Yeah, if you go and you stay at home for a nice, I don't know, lockdown in New York these days, but so you can imagine on a peaceful day, a morning, Sunday, like today, right? Yeah, Sunday morning. You stay home and relax a bit, read a bit, the mind gets peaceful. Then you have to do some shopping for breakfast tomorrow morning. So you go around the corner, I don't know if possible somewhere, yeah, so, or a little bit further than the corner of the block, you somewhere else. You do quick shopping, and then you come back home, and then you feel tired. But actually, why do you feel tired? Not from the physical exercise, but from the impressions of sensory perception, you see? So that means that the objects of the 5 senses will never produce any form of happiness. It's all very temporary, you know? That we know whatever food or drink or substances we take, it's never really giving us ultimate happiness. No? It's never really doing that. So that means that why it says in certain texts, the sources actually are the doors to suffering. Especially if you don't understand it, then you think it's going to make you happy. If you eat more or drink more or take substances or whatsoever, but actually on the long term, it's not very constructive. So that means that the doors of the senses basically are the doors of suffering, as we sometimes say. And the main emphasis should be on mental development, yeah, mental consciousness. That's why the Buddha was mostly interested in that aspect of mental development. Yeah. Because with mental development, you can understand the cause of happiness and the cause of suffering much better. And it's true, right? If you feel a little bit more peaceful with your mental consciousness, then it's much more satisfying. Yeah, the sense is never satisfying. There's never a person on this planet who has so much money, fame, wealth, possessions, can do everything they like. They say, oh, now I'm completely done. I'm completely satisfied. That's it. What they do if they get a lot of money, we see the most wealthy persons on this planet, especially in the West, they want to do space travel, right? Yeah, they want to go to a very dry moon. It's true, there's nothing exciting on the moon to be found. But that's what they do with billions and billions of dollars, you know, but they're not happy. They want to do something more. They think that will make them happy, but you can already predict it. It's not going to, sitting in one of those space, to travel so fast, it gives such an impact on your body. The G-force is so fast, so strong that you get so tired after, you know. And then you can look at the Earth through a little window. You see, same as you see on a computer screen. That's the kick they get out of it, but it's not really producing any form of happiness, right? So that means in worldly life, or the sensory perception, so to say, there's nothing that gives us everlasting happiness. Yeah, you see that? So that means it's very interesting that the main thing comes from mental consciousness, the real happiness or the satisfaction. And that's why you see certain meditators having a very simple life, living in very simple conditions. They're so content and so happy, you know. So that proves that the happiness comes from within, not from external aspects. We need certain kind of things, of course, to have normal conditions of life, but it's not giving us ultimate kind of. And that's exactly what we see in modern society. There's a lot of anxiety, fear, depression, and that's why the Holiness Dalai Lama says very often, you know, we need education of the mind. That's what we need, you know, in the West. It's very important in Western society. Yeah. But then, and mainly the mental education of our mental consciousness. How do I produce more forms of constructive thinking, and how do I reduce and eliminate these destructive emotions? Yeah. So you can see already with here, with feeling, contact, and we judge, or like, dislike, and then we get either irritated, or we get attached, and we want more, or we want less, you know. So it's going back and forth based on this sensory perception and contact. Yeah. Yeah, so that is contact arises from feeling. So feeling we cannot stop because that's an omnipresent mental factor. But then when we like something, we get attached, right? We need this. And when we don't like something, we have aversion. We don't like this. And that's the nature of our reality. We like happiness and don't like suffering. Yeah, so wanting happiness, not wanting suffering. But then having a misunderstanding on how to obtain this, that causes a problem. Yeah, we all want happiness, don't want suffering. All human beings on this planet have the same wish, right? But there's only mental consciousness that can understand what is the real cause of happiness and what's the real cause of suffering. So we cannot accomplish that with sensory perception only. Yeah, so that's a very clear point here. I mean, in general in the Buddhist teaching, but also here with. So there's many techniques of just observing, right? Being the observer when there's a particular feeling, you just observe. Is this, you know, or is happiness, or is I don't like this person? Or you just observe, right? If you know how to observe, that you prevent yourself from getting irritated. It's one technique, so to say, to be the observer instead of getting engaged and getting in this emotional hijack. Like my friend in prison, and then if you get an emotional hijack, then you gonna maybe make mistakes for self and others. Yeah? So that's why this observance or being training in awareness helps us a lot to not act in particular situations. So we just observe it. Yeah? So there's different techniques. But if you cut ignorance, as we saw, then these destructive emotions come not up. And then even when all kind of feelings come, of course, you observe that, but anger and strong aversion and desire, attachment will not really overtake you because you cut ignorance. And that means you take away this kind of concrete building blocks of the destructive emotions. They need that. I, my possession, my this, my that. You know? So if you see that everything is in the nature of dependent origination and nothing exists from its own side, then you counteract this ignorance, right? And then these destructive emotions, they are not that strong anymore. And that's why His Holiness Dalai Lama sometimes says, if you contemplate emptiness, like, 16 times a day, I mean, his own says, a certain amount of day, but let's say 16 times a day, then it looks like, his own says, afflictions don't arise. Very interesting. That means if you contemplate emptiness, you understand that things are interdependent, that things don't have this concrete aspect of reality we think they have. And that helps a lot by counteracting the afflictions. So if you combine those kind of methodologies of just observing, understanding ultimate nature of reality in relation with interdependence, then the grasping to objects or aversion to objects or people will become less, right? Yeah. So that's the kind of different methodologies that can be done to stop a few of these links, right? Or at least make them less heavy. Yeah. So that is feeling, right? In verse number 5. Yeah. Then in verse number 6, it talks about conditioned by this feeling, yeah, arises craving. Yeah, so craving arises because of feeling, and then we want it, Yeah, we want it. So the craving, and the next one, grasping. So 8 and 9 in the 12 links, right? Craving is 8, grasping is number 9. So craving and grasping are two types of attachment, or desire, as we sometimes translate. Yeah, and grasping is a bit stronger than craving. So it's a very similar function, but the strength is different. Yeah. So it says here, conditioned by feeling, arises this craving, right? Yeah. And then it becomes more intense, and then we grasp. So in the 12 links in the picture, if you look at the image of the wheel of life, yeah, then craving is like a Tibetan person, because most of the drawings are so Tibetan person drinking chang, the Tibetan beer. It's kind of, because if you drink beer, you have a little bit and you want to have more, right? So that's the craving aspect. And it's true, and it's like drinking salty water, right? It's in our people in ordinary society, as we know, more, but actually we never get satisfied. Yeah, so that means same as the persons now going into space travel, there's no satisfaction, so they always look for something else to get satisfied, right? So it's drinking salty water when you're thirsty. Yeah, so that's kind of like drinking the beer in this image of, if you look next time on the image of the outer circle of the wheel of life, right? The Yama holding that circle, then you can see, Tibetan drinking chang. Yeah, yeah, of craving. And then the next one will be a monkey going for food, grasping. And you can see the difference. Beer is kind of very subtle, it's a little bit more. But monkeys, I don't know, in New York, probably not, but but when I was in India, especially in the north of India, Dharamshala, there's one center of the FPMT called Tushita, right? So there are many monkeys. And then sometimes I did retreat, and the monkeys, they know we don't really harm them. And some of them are quite big. So then I'm sitting in my room, and it was so hot one day, I opened the door, and there's offerings there. And the monkey just walks in, looks at me, and then walks away, And then his friends come, and then it's mine. Eating it, putting here, and keeping it, and then you can see this more stronger form of grasping to its things in life that you think it brings happiness, but actually it's not, like food, for example. Yeah, so that's in the drawing, you will see a monkey picking fruit from a tree. Yeah, so that's kind of grasping. It's a bit stronger than drinking chang. Yeah, so that's probably why they decide to make those two different drawings, I think. Yeah. Yeah, so that's kind of craving and grasping. Yeah. Yeah, so that's, yeah. Then in verse number 7, it talks about that, because what happens here is kind of, we have an act, and that act leaves an imprint in consciousness, right? At the third link, remember? Ignorance, karma, and consciousness. So there's an imprint in our continuity of consciousness. And that imprint comes through ripening at the time of death with the 12 links. Normally with karma, whatever activity we do, we have many activities. And they leave imprints in the mind, and they come to ripening even in this life. Yeah, but with the 12 links, it has the potential to throw you in another form of existence. So it's slightly different. It's more heavy karma we're talking about. Yeah, so that's why all the factors have to be complete to generate this heavy karma. But also, like, you know, saying something nice to a person, or generating love and kindness and compassion, then later on we remember that easily. That's also law of cause and effect, right? Within the continuity. Yeah? So seeds are planted in consciousness and they come to ripening. So that means that the more seeds we plant of positive behavior, that will come to fruition more in the future. Right? So if you take last, a few weeks ago, I had a very interesting dialogue with Rupert Sheldrake. I don't know if you know him. He's quite a famous biologist. He's a bit controversial in his views as a scientist, but he's a very interesting personality and a very nice person to talk to. His wife is also Buddhist, so it's very easy. He told me his house is full of Tara images. But yeah, he's a very interesting personality. He wrote a lot of books, as you know, international bestsellers. So we had a dialogue with our new project, Science and Wisdom Live, and we talked about ultimate nature of reality. You know, so it's very interesting. And then also you can talk about what we talk about, karma, in a very scientific way, if you want to. Because what it is kind of, we have these seeds in our mind, right? Of looking at a screen, talking with a person, does something positive, does something negative. Those actions, they stop, or the continuity of that particular consciousness stops and leaves an imprint. We say imprint, but actually what it is just potentials in the mind, right? Or we call it in scientific terms, probabilities. So that means that when the probabilities meet a particular condition, they come to ripening. And that is very similar to what we see in quantum mechanics. There are probabilities, and that depends on external factors to see what we actually preserve, what we actually perceive, or what actually happens. There's many probabilities there, and then whatever it meets, external conditions, then we can see something. So with our continuity of consciousness, very similar, right? We have all these imprints in our mind, or habituation patterns, or leaves imprints or probabilities, and then depending on a particular condition of thinking about something, it activates, right? And that's why people who are very optimistic, they don't easily get depressed, because this habituation to be an optimist is not capable of activating too many negative thoughts or patterns of negative thoughts or the imprints of negative thoughts. A person who is very negative in life, it's very easy to activate negative thought patterns again and again and again. So it's very similar. It's talking about probabilities, right? Yeah, if you study it in the form of obsessive compulsive disorder, as Jeffrey Schwartz did, from the point of view of neuroscience, it's very interesting. There's a particular amount of release of neurotransmitters who produce this probability of either washing your hands or going to the garden. So the more you train your mind in thinking in a particular way, it generates more probabilities in that direction. You see, so that's the power of habituation. It's very scientific, actually. So when I was talking with Rupert Sheldrake the other 2 weeks ago, we talked about these aspects, and he said, "Yeah, oh, that sounds very scientific." It is true, right? It is very scientific. Yeah. So yeah, that's the same here also. So that means that you create a particular karma at a particular time, and it comes through ripening when the right conditions are met. So we have all these types of karma, positive, negative, neutral, in our continuity. And that meets external conditions. So we have so many probabilities. For example, take COVID, right? We have the karma to be in a lockdown, but we don't have the karma maybe to get sick, right? And there are people who have the karma to get sick and not die, and there are people who have the karma to get sick and die. So that means in every of us, we have this incredible complex system of probabilities that meets external conditions. It's also very complex, you know. So you can see that karma is not that something is magical. It's very scientific, actually. Yeah. So here, same thing, that we have these imprints in our mind, and they come to ripening at a time of death to create another rebirth, right? There should be something that creates a rebirth. Nothing is random. Yeah. So that means there's a substantial cause, and there are corporate conditions. It's very scientific. Actually, Buddhism is, that's why His Holiness, a few decades ago, when His Holiness said, we have to build a bridge with science, then many other world leaders in religious, actually, religious leaders, they said to His Holiness, don't do this, don't do this. That will be the end of religion. And His Holiness says, I don't think so. That means it's true, right? Buddhism is very open to examining things and analyzing things. And it's very scientific, as you just can see, right? Even karma, it looks very complex and is very complex, but it's a very scientifically based interpretation of the continuity of cause and effect relationships within the continuity of a person. That's what it is. It's very, yeah. So that's, yeah, here you see the same thing, because you generate a particular karma, you create it, that leaves potentials in your mind at the time of death, that comes to ripening by craving, grasping, and it comes into existence, right? Yeah, you see that? Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, so that means it comes to in existence. That means existence here, number 10, sometimes we translate as becoming. Yeah, in verse number 7, it says, when there is grasping, there the existence of one own who craves come into being. So sometimes we translate link number 10 as becoming. Right? So there's two types of karma here. One at the time of the cause, you know, at the time of the second link, karmic formation. So that we mostly translate as throwing karma or propelling karma. That leaves an imprint or potential in your mind to throw you in another state of rebirth, either positive or negative, high rebirth or low rebirth, right? So that seed is there, planted consciousness. Then when we die, then just before the clear-eyed mind comes, there's a kind of conceptualities, right? That cause to ripen by craving and grasping. That ripens this karma or activates this karma. So then it becomes link number 10, existence, and that we often translate as establishing karma. But establishing karma in the sense it will establish the rebirth. Because when you die, the consciousness leaves, goes into the bardo, and then you're reborn, right? So that establishes the next life. So link number 10, existence, actually establishes the next life. Yeah. Yeah. So if there's no grasping, it says, then there's no activation of karma, right? So when you give up afflictions or eliminate afflictions, then there's no cause for rebirth in samsara anymore. You see that? Because there's nothing that can activate. Even if you have a lot of negative karma or positive karma created, you know, then, but if you eliminate afflictions, then there's no way for it to get ripened. So there's no way it can ripen. So you won't be born within a cyclic existence if you eliminate afflictions, right? Yeah, so that's, yeah, also it says here. If there's no grasping, then being freed, he would not or she would not take samsaric birth. Yeah, so that's, of course, if there's no ignorance, there's no karmic formation planted in consciousness, right? So also in that regard, you can say if the first link is not there, everything stops. Yeah, but also here, at the time of death, when if there's no craving and grasping, then also karma doesn't get activated, right? Yeah, you see that? Yeah. And it's very interesting. Sometimes habituations comes up in dreams. The more we habituate to things in a daily life, then it comes up in dreams, right? So it's very similar. When we die, then what is most, where we habituate ourselves towards the most, that will come to ripening, right? Once in the monastery, we have a house called I My House. We built on the advice of Rinpoche, Amsoba Rinpoche, for Western monks to have better conditions. You know? So we live with a few Western monks there in the monastery in Sarah. And one day there was a crow, a very old one. He couldn't fly anymore, so it was in the tree. Then he couldn't stay in the tree anymore. He was falling down. So then he was too old, you know. So we took him in a box around the stupa to get very, very precious relics in that stupa from Rinpoche and many other lamas. So we took him around, and very sad, but very interesting. So then before it died, there was a few crows flying over and making sound. So here we go. And then it died. So that means that he had this kind of strong inclination again to be the same or something like that, right? So that could activate his consciousness again to be born as a crow, something like that. But luckily he went over the stupa, so maybe next lifetime better. Yeah, so that means that's how it works, right? We grasp and crave to habituation patterns. You know, that's what it is. Yeah. So that's here what it says, then existence come into being. Yeah. And then verse number 8, it talks, okay, then you go into the bardo and you are reborn. Yeah, so that's what it says in verse number 8. This birth is comprised of 5 aggregates, as we just talked about, right? The 4 of the mind and the physical. Yeah, the form, feeling, discrimination, composition of factors, and consciousness. Yeah. And from existence arises birth. Yeah, that means existence from this previous links of becoming, you produces birth. Yeah, so in verse number 8, birth is in number 11, right? And then, because we are born, then guess what happens? You know, we decay, right? Old age and death happens. We cannot prevent that. It's a given. You don't have to do anything for that. It just happens to us. So that's why His Holiness says old age involves a lot of things. Things become more difficult in life. It's not that things become better and better. Things become worse and worse and worse. You get older, right? Your teeth and your eyesight and hearing and physical is getting worse and worse and worse. So that's the kind of aspect of samsaric suffering, right? Old age and death. Yeah, and then you die. Yeah. Yeah, so there's nothing to worry about because we cannot stop it anyway. That's what His Holiness always says, right? If you cannot do anything about a problem, then you shouldn't worry about it because you can't do anything. If you can do something about a problem, then you also shouldn't worry because you should act and solve the problem. Yeah, that comes from Shantideva's Bodhisattva Avatara. But if you have a problem and you cannot really solve it, like COVID, be stuck for some time until everybody is vaccinated and the virus slowly stops spreading. Until then, we just have to deal with the issue, right? So we cannot solve it, so why worry about it too much? Yeah, that's a very helpful advice, you know? Yeah. Old age and death. Yeah. And then misery, it talks about misery, it talks about mental suffering here. Moaning, it's talking about it, or verbalizing the suffering. And suffering, it says in the last of verse number 8, talks about actually physical aspects or related with the sense organs. Yeah, so that's verse number 1 until including verse number 8 talks about samsaric rebirth, right, with the 12 links. So to summarize that, then also in one of the texts by Nagarjuna, it says Tangbo Gyedan Gunyamons means first 8 and 9. First link being ignorance, right? 8 being craving, and 9 being grasping. Yeah, so those 3 are afflictions. Yeah, ignorance, craving, and grasping are afflictions. Tampo gedam kunyamons, nidan chu leyentis, nidan chu 2 and 10 are karma. We just talked about throwing karma, link number 2, right? Karmic formation. Throwing karma, link number 2. And 10 being becoming, the establishing karma, right? Yeah, becoming or existence is establishing karma. And that is actually, those 2 aspects are karma. So you see 3 are afflictions, 2 are karma. You see that? Punyamons, lama duni dugnaltes, the remaining 7 are suffering. 7 plus 3 plus 2 is 12, right? So that means that 3 are afflictions, right? And 2 are karma, and the remaining 7 are in the nature of suffering. That's what it says. Yeah? And then there's another kind of, in the commentaries, same text in Nagarjuna, Ratnavali, for example, talks about these points. Yeah? That also by the power of the 3, the 2 arise. And by the power of the 2, the 7 arise. And by the power of the 7, the 3 arise again. That means that there's 3 afflictions, right? Ignorance, craving, and grasping. Yeah, because of ignorance, craving, and grasping, we create karma, right? Yeah, we created 2 types of karma. Yeah? And because of the two types of karma, we have this contaminated aggregates of body and mind. And because of having these contaminated aggregates, we have contaminated sense powers and we have contaminated consciousness that comes in contact with objects. And then we have pleasant feeling, we generate attachment, unpleasant feeling, we generate aversion. And then again, we do the same thing over and over again. So that talks about the wheel of life, right? That it's a cycle. We have to break out the cycle. So the cycle of depression, you have to break out and go for a walk, do some exercise, talk, become more social, and then, you know, to break the cycle and then look back and solve the problems. Yeah, so here we have in a cycle, it's a bit more complicated, but also it's possible to break it. Yeah, so that's how we are born in samsara, because how to break it, that's then explained in verse number 10, 11, and 12. Yeah, that we can get out of this rebirth, you know, of this contaminated birth, sickness, old age, and death. Yeah, so how do we get out of there? Then in verse number 10, it says, the root of cyclic existence is composition of factors. Yeah, so here it's very interesting. It says the root of cyclic existence, but we know the roots of cyclic existence is ignorance, right? Yeah. But here the meaning is the main cause for suffering in samsara is karma. Yeah, the composition of factors is karma. So often we say the direct cause of suffering is karma, right? But karma and afflictions. Yeah, karma and afflictions are the direct cause, but the root cause is ignorance. Yeah, you see that? Yeah. So that's because karma and afflictions actually propels us in suffering, right? Yeah. But ignorance is behind it all. Yeah, but actually the real aspect that causes suffering, or the direct aspect that causes suffering, is karma and afflictions, right? And the fuel behind that is ignorance. And so ignorance is the root, and karma and afflictions are the direct cause. Yeah, you see that? Yeah, so that's in relation with this verse, you can explain it in that way. Also, Dharmakirti in the Pramana Vartika also talks about these points that karma and craving, for example, it talks about are the real main causes for suffering. Because it's true, craving is one of the factors that activates karmic actions for reborn in samsara, right? So that's in one way it's true. Yeah. So that means karma and karma being created, that karma, and that what activates that karma, those two actually are the main cause for suffering, right? But those two are rooted in ignorance. Yeah, so that's is a very interesting analogy, or Dharmakirti mix. Yeah. So here it talks about those points in this first line of verse number 10, that the root of cyclic existing is composition factors. In a sense, the main cause for karmic birth or contaminated birth is this particular karma, right? Yeah. And therefore, the wise do not engage in conception of factors. That means they don't create these kind of factors anymore. Yeah, that in the sense, if you understand emptiness, realize emptiness, you cut down craving and grasping, and you cut down new forms of being born in samsaric existence. For example, if you become an Arya being, if you have direct perception, of emptiness, you don't create newly the 12 links anymore. Only previous created 12 links have to be purified, but you don't create new karma to be born in samsara anymore, if you have direct perception of emptiness. Yeah. Yeah, so that's also implied here. And thus the unwise are the agents, and the wise see reality. Yeah, so the unwise, they just in this emotional hijack, of being born again and again. But the wise, they realize emptiness and they stop this process. So that's why you have to realize emptiness. And that's why the next chapter, 18, we're going to dive into the world of emptiness, right? So that's kind of very essential, so to say. And chapter 18, as I said, is the root or the essence of the whole text of Nagarjuna's fundamental wisdom. Yeah. So then in verse number 11 says, with the cessation of ignorance, composition of factor will not arise. Yeah, so if you don't have ignorance, then you don't create karma, right? You see that? Yeah, so, yeah. The cessation of ignorance occurs through insight and meditation. Yeah, so that's mainly referring here to the direct perception of emptiness, because then you don't have the first link anymore, ignorance. If the first link, ignorance, is not there anymore, then you don't create new 12 links anymore. Yeah. To the cessation of these, those will not be manifest. Yeah, so meaning, if you eliminate karma and afflictions, then it will never come into being, right? And the entire mass of suffering indeed thereby completely ceases. So that's kind of how we eliminate the 12 links. Yeah, so that's a little bit about the 12 links and how we are a very brief presentation, right? Just less than 2 hours, but normally you can study this for weeks if you want to, and especially in relation with different schools of Buddhist philosophy or sutra or Vajrayana interpretations. It's very interesting. Yeah, and yeah, one more thing to say to make it a complete presentation is that the 12 links are either created or coming to completions in 2 or more lifetimes, right? Because in one lifetime, you create a karma and you may be activated and then you get reborn, right? So you need a minimum of 2 lifetimes. Yeah. So that means this lifetime you create an act of morality, yeah, and that ripens at the time of death, and next lifetime you're born as person rebirth. Or you practice morality, at the time of death you get angry all of a sudden, and you can be born in other states, and then the karma to be born as a human ripens a bit later. So then you have 3 lifetimes. Yeah, so you have a minimum of 2 and maximum of 3 lifetimes to complete all the 12 factors. Yeah, so that's, you can find back in most of the Lamrim presentations, right? It's quite mostly clearly explained how that works. Yeah, so that's a very short presentation on the 12 links of chapter 26 of Nagarjuna's Fundamental Wisdom. And if there's any questions, then we can still spend some time on that. But yeah, the 12 links are very essential in our Lamrim trainings, as I said, from the point of view of the small, middling, and great scope, from the point of view of rebirth, understanding it, and how does it function, how does it work. It's very essential. And then, because we Westerners, it's good to relate it also with scientific findings. Then it matches perfectly. I mean, not perfectly, but there's a lot of correlations between the correlations. The terminology sometimes is slightly different, but it's very, very similar. The potential, what we just talked about, these potentials in consciousness, or the development, how it gets activated, and how we perceive things depending on our mental intentions. What you perceive and what another person perceives depends on our inclinations, habituations, thought patterns. It's very, very interesting. Yeah. Question? Yeah.
Geshe, thank you so much. I had a question. In the 12 links of dependent origination, I always wondered, in the picture for feeling, it's like an arrow in the eye.
Yeah.
And I always wondered because, feelings can be pleasant or neutral.
Yeah.
So I wondered why it's like such a vivid, painful image for everything.
Yeah, it's true. So, I mean, probably because the feeling on all the types of sensory perception, the eye is the most sensitive, right? So that means if something goes to the eye, we protect it. It's the first thing we protect. So that's probably the reason, not just a little bit of dirt, but an error. So that means that it's the most sensitive aspect of our feeling, right? That's probably the reason why. I'm not 100% sure, but yeah, it could be the reason. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So there's another aspect of feeling in relation with this, is the all-pervasive compounding form of suffering. Yeah, that's another interpretation for this point, maybe. Like the real suffering to be understood, as the Buddha said, you should know suffering, is not the suffering of suffering, is not the suffering of chains, but the all-pervasive compounding form of suffering. Meaning, as long as you have karma and afflictions, you have suffering, right, underneath the surface. Yeah? So that is kind of, for us, ordinary beings, because we don't understand that real suffering, it's like a hair in our palm of our hands. It's like, oh, is there something or not? We don't really recognize it. But for an Arya being, a person who has direct perception of emptiness, it's like a hair in the eye. So it understands much better. Anyway, there's another thing to think about it, but probably the reason is because the eye is the most sensitive aspect of the 5 senses, right? Yeah, probably, yeah. Yeah, it's a very interesting picture. You can learn a lot from the drawings. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Otherwise, we can.
Geshe, there is a question. Pemo, is it possible? And she writes in the chat, is it possible any actions we do in this lifetime, they ripen in lifetime? Example, we give something to others or to our teachers, and it ripens in this lifetime by us receiving or being well paid.
Yeah, so that's true. Certain forms of karma, especially stronger form of karma in relation with the object you create a karma of, like teachers or holy beings, right? And with motivation or intention being very virtuous. Yeah, so the stronger the karma is, the easier for its potential to come to ripening. Yeah, so that's one of the aspects. So the strongest the karma is, that ripens first. Right? If there's an equal amount of two types of karma, then the habituation that is stronger, right? Yeah. And if that's also the same, then what is more recent will ripen first. So that's kind of threefold kind of way of when karma ripens first. But that's just a general interpretation of ripening of karma. The 12 links only ripens at the time of death, right? Because it propels a rebirth. So that's what we call throwing karma and establishing karma. Yeah, there's two aspects there. We also have completion karma that actually creates the environment we are born. Yeah. And then also we have the karma on daily and day-to-day base. You know, that if we create something heavy, either positive or negative, it can ripen. Yeah? So in regards with the teacher as part of the question, for example, it can happen that, you know, negative karma just ripens in a dream or something, instead of being a part of to ripen in the future negative state or low state of existence, right? So that's many possibilities, and it depends on how heavy the karma is and which object is related to. Yes, we know to kill a mosquito is not good, but it's less heavy than to kill a human being, because a human being has more potential to develop, yeah, or killing a normal human being, so to say, or killing a spiritual leader. Yeah, so a spiritual leader can do much more benefit, like his holiness, to society. So it's heavier karma if you kill a person like that. Yeah, and if you do good things in relation with these kind of holy beings, then also the karma is stronger. Yeah, and then it can even ripen in one lifetime. Yeah, it's possible. Yeah. Yeah.
Geshe,
yeah.
You mentioned just now that the establishing karma ripens right before the dawning of the clear light mind.
Yeah, you've paid a lot of attention. Very good.
Okay, yeah. So when does the throwing karma, when is that activated?
So the throwing karma gets activated before the clear light mind comes. There's a kind of what we call the 80 conceptions, right?
Yes.
So that's according to the Vajrayana interpretation. But also in the interpretation of Abhidharma, it talks about the actually mind of death is neutral, right? And just before that happens, it's a kind of still possibility to be either virtuous, non-virtuous, or neutral, right? So that means also there, the moment the karma gets activated is just before the clear light mind, or just before actually the mind of death. Yeah, it can be just a split second. But the mind has to have conceptuality, a very coarse form of conceptuality, to generate craving and grasping, right? So that means the clear light mind is free of these kind of conceptualities. So that means it happens just before the clear light mind comes into being. Yeah, and that's in the sutra system as well as the Vajrayana system is basically the same. Only the intensity or the description of the subtle mind is slightly different. Yeah.
So you say that is link number 10, becoming or assistance.
Yeah,
so,
the throwing karma, right? The completion karma.
Yeah,
become,
yeah.
Yeah,
so the link number 2, the throwing karma, when is that karma activated?
That link number 2 is created at the time of the act, right? So act of killing, or the act of morality. Say you practice morality, taking the Mahayana precepts for a week, right? You take Mahayana precepts for a week, that karma is stopped. The activity stops after the week. But it leaves the potential. It's throwing karma. With all the right conditions present, it can throw you in a good rebirth, right, as a human being. So that's created like a few weeks ago, right, when you did the Mahayana precepts. So then when you die, that gets activated when you think about, oh, that was amazing what I did there, and I dedicated it all for enlightenment, and I dedicated it all for all sentient beings, and that activates this positive karma, and then you can get reborn. So at that time, it activates that, and it becomes the link of becoming or establishing karma. Yeah, and that's been activated. Then you go into clear light mind, then your consciousness leaves your body, you go into the bardo, and at that time already your bardo is in accordance with your future existence, right? Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Okay, thank you very much then. Thank you for letting me come to New York without having to fly. Yeah. 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 So thank you so much for organizing it and yeah, working for the center, so to say. And yeah, and then we meet again next week, not next week, next
July
month.
18th. Next month, July 18th.
Next month. Yeah, yeah. So we have Discovering Buddhism, because most of the weekends are full, but Discovering Buddhism course ends here at 2 o'clock, 1 o'clock. So then I have 1 hour, 2 hours breaks, and then we can do this. Yeah, yeah. Otherwise the weekends are quite full. Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much. And then we dedicate. We have a few dedications. So also try to dedicate in a way that the dedication becomes less contaminated, in the sense of thinking yourself making the dedication and the dedication itself, right? Or the act of dedicating, and the aim we dedicate towards do are anti-abandonment existence. Yeah. So then we understand a little bit of emptiness, and that helps us to cut down this contaminated aspect of ignorance, you know. So that's also been advised always to reflect on emptiness when you dedicate. Yeah, so we can dedicate according to the prayers we have. Yeah, so then dedicate for particular purposes of spreading of the Buddha Dharma, long and healthy life of the precious teachers, as well as the 2 bodhicittas, obstacles to be removed and quickly to achieve state enlightenment. Yeah. Do you have prayers? Yeah.
Yes, yes, I will.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So take those things into account, and then we recite the prayers together. Yeah. Yeah. Mandala is no need. We do another time. Yeah. Just go down. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Spreading of Buddha teachings and long and healthy precious life of our long and healthy gurus, and all the wish be spontaneously fulfilled. Dagi jina sabba gewa di tendan roa gyundang gamba geba jazan lozan raba yi tingbe ningbo ringdu sa je shu kare rawe gorwe singam so pendan dewa malu chere zigwan tenzin gyaso yi jabe shite badu tengyu tuzan sam shehen jahang yun ya ten sing yong bel Günse dogo ze gozum go wehele münju bahada so tuje gond shabde sho janjo semjo rimboche magye pana ye yuchi geba namba meba yang gone gonde belwa toni tawa rimboche magye pana ye yuchi geba namba meba yang gone gonde belwa show. Then, as long as space remains, yeah, as long as space remains, and as long as my greater beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the suffering of my greater beings. May the King of Dharma, Tsongkhapa's way of Dharma practice flourish, and may the omens of obstacles be pacified, and all on the circumstances complete. To the power of having made single-pointed requests, to you, Losang Drapa, may all unfortunate manifestations of degenerate AIDS, illness, famine, quarreling, epidemic diseases, conduct, spirits, and fears, and so forth pacified, and excellent connections of condition increase. Please bless me that my wishes be swiftly fulfilled. By evoking the power of loving kindness and compassion of Shenrezig, through the force of making extensive prayers, may all sickness, war, fighting, famine be completely pacified, so that all beings have long, healthy, and happy lives. May the Guru's life be long and stable, and may all beings acquire states of faith and happiness. And may others, without exception, accumulate merit and purify negativity. And may we be blessed quickly take Buddhahood. Gyewa gyunde yanda lama da dame chegi pela longje sadan lamgi yunda rabzo ne doche changi ko ba nyoto shu. Okay, thank you so much. See you next month. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Geshe, for making time for us in your very busy schedule.
No problem. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much.
See you next month.
See you next month. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.